Good morning and welcome to Hope, Faith, and Joy Daily Devotion with me, Pastor Amanda. It is Monday morning of Christmas week, and we are continuing in Genesis this morning, starting with chapter 32. So, what we find out is that after Jacob's encounter with Laban and all of that, he goes on his way and he heads back home to his family. And what we find is that Jacob is still very aware of how he left his family. And it says here in verse 3 that Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau and instructing them to let him know that his brother is coming and that he sends presents in advance of him. And so we recognize that Jacob's very aware that, there could still be some brother rivalry in between them and everything. And so there's this anxiety that Jacob is experiencing, trying to help maybe ease his re-entry back into the family tribe or clan, however you want to look at that. So we see that he's kind of sweet talking his brother in advance by sending in presents of animals and flocks, which of course would make him a very rich man. This was a great gift that he was given. And what I think is also interesting is that even though Jacob has received the blessing from his father and even from God, that he has this prayer of anxiety even with God. Like he knows he has this promise, but he has this doubt at the same time. And so he has this prayer to God. And I love it. He goes, I'm not worthy, of your steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. So now like Jacob's like sweet talking God, going like, I know that you're faithful. I know that this is good. And yet I'm concerned. I'm concerned for human actions in the midst of this. And I think this speaks so clearly to our journeys with God and how often that we know God's promises, but we just know humans, that we ourselves mess up the promise, that other people can mess up the promise. And what we forget is that even in the mess ups, God can work in those. But we have these moments where we're just like, Jacob says it very clearly. Deliver me, please, from my brother Esau, for I am afraid of him. So, even with the blessing, even with everything, there's still this humanity sense of fear of what could happen in this. And so we find that Jacob is reminding God of your promise. So, you need to protect me, you need to deliver me. And so we find that he's doing this. So, in order to prep things up, he's sending all of his flocks and all of his people out in advance. And what we find then is this kind of really cool story that happens. So, we find that even Jacob, he sends even his wives and his children separately because if he's going to get harmed in this, he wants to try to still protect his family as best he can. And so it says, though, that he spends the night alone in this space. And what happens is he wrestles with a man. And we agree, commentators and everybody that he wrestled with God. So Jacob wrestled with God. But a few things that we need to recognize is that, there's this sense that if you've seen the face of God, you could potentially die. We learn this from Moses and throughout Exodus of like seeing God could bring harm to a human being. And so what we realize though is that Jacob's wrestling happens until twilight. So, and where Jacob says, I've seen the face of God, he probably didn't fully see the face of God. It was a twilight that he was able to encounter God, because God even says it's getting towards daybreak. You've got to let go of me. You have to let go of me, because he's aware of what could happen to Jacob. And so that's when, like, God does, it says that punches him in the hip socket. And so now Jacob has a limp for the rest of his life. Now I'm kind of jumping around within this chapter. So they fight. The God says, "Let me go," and Jacob still holds on. So he gets punched in the hip socket, and then day is breaking. It said so. The twilight's still there, and then Jacob asks this question: "I will not let go of you unless you bless me." And then Jacob says, "What is your name?" And then what happens is then God gives Jacob a new name. So he goes from being Jacob to being Israel. So that's really important there. So now Jacob's name is Israel. But do you notice how God doesn't answer his question? There are sometimes there's questions out there that never get answered. But at the same time, what we find in this struggle is that Jacob's wrestling with God is changing their relationship. If we think about it, how often do we find that we struggle with God? I mean, Jacob has used trickery his whole life. He's done all of these things that are not necessarily in the best taste. And this wrestling with God is God saying, like, there's a change that's got to happen. You've got to change your ways. And recognizing that change and our relationship, you've gotten a new name. And what we see then is then, of course, Jacob goes again, "Please tell me your name." And what he receives is a blessing from God. And what we find out is there's really no winner or loser in this struggle. There's a change in relationship is what happens, but one doesn't win and one doesn't lose. I mean, the fact that Jacob can walk away is amazing that he didn't die in the grasp of God, and all he has is a limp. That's more like a trophy. It's not a burden, it's a trophy that I survived being in God's presence that closely. And so it's really an amazing moment that we have here, but at the same time we have unanswered questions. And I think that's really important to think about our own personal relationships when we ask God why, or what's this, or all of these kinds of things, that we still don't get to have all the answers. That is God and God's alone. And so we see that in our own lives we can have these moments of struggle. We have these moments in which our relationship changes with God, and we become closer through that, but it's not easy. It really is a struggle, and it can be a fight with God, because we've got to learn. And that word, I struggle with it sometimes, but submitting to what God wants. But realizing that when we submit to God, God's got our best interest. Now, submitting to another human being, not necessarily so. I don't think that's always right. However, submitting to God, though, is the perfect person who knows what we really need and want to be fruitful, to be able to experience joy and abundance in our lives. And so that's what we see is this struggle to becoming obedient to God. And yet, look at the blessing that can come out of that. And so it's kind of a tough chapter to read and to integrate into our own lives, but it still gives me a lot of hope, faith, and joy, and I hope it does for you too. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye.